Avoidant men melt when you do this one simple thing, and the irony is that most people spend months, sometimes years, trying everything except the one shift that actually changes the entire emotional direction of the dynamic. Because when someone pulls back, becomes unpredictable, goes quiet, or gives you just enough presence to keep you emotionally engaged but never fully secure, your instinct is to do more, explain more, prove more, reach more, when in reality that response is exactly what tightens the internal distance instead of closing it. And what makes this even harder is that it doesn't feel like a strategy from your side. It feels like love. It feels like care. It feels like responsibility. But from the inside of their emotional wiring, that same energy can start to register differently, not as connection, but as pressure. And that shift is so subtle that nobody notices it happening in real time. So you end up in this loop where you're trying harder to get closer while the emotional system on the other side is quietly stepping back to regain balance. And before you even realize it, you're both reacting to each other in ways that were never really about the present moment, but about internal emotional regulation. And if you're watching this because someone like that is on your mind right now, there's a good chance you've already felt that confusing push-pull where one moment things feel open and warm and the next moment they feel distant again for no obvious reason. And that inconsistency is exactly what keeps people stuck in overthinking cycles that don't lead to clarity. Before we go deeper into what actually makes them melt, and no, it's not what most people assume, if you find yourself constantly analyzing avoidant behavior and trying to decode emotional distance like it's a puzzle you have to solve, you might as well subscribe, because you're already in the mindset of understanding patterns most people completely miss, and what we're breaking down here will probably save you from a lot of unnecessary emotional guesswork. The secret nobody explains about avoidant men is that they are not disconnected from emotion, they are actually highly responsive to it, but their system is calibrated around control of emotional intensity rather than the absence of it, which means they don't avoid people because they don't feel anything, they step back because they feel something and don't trust the environment to stay emotionally manageable if they fully engage. And that distinction changes everything, because most advice assumes the problem is lack of effort or lack of love, when in reality the problem is often emotional overwhelm that activates a withdrawal response. So when someone tries to get closer through more texting, more explaining, more emotional intensity, more reassurance seeking, it doesn't always translate as safety. It can register internally as escalation. Not because the intention is wrong, but because the nervous system reads increased emotional demand as something that requires space to process, not something that invites more closeness in that moment. This is why avoidant men can sometimes feel incredibly warm in one phase and suddenly distant in another without any clear external reason, because what's shifting is not the connection itself, but their internal threshold for emotional load. And if you've ever felt like you were doing everything right but still losing them emotionally, this is usually the invisible layer you were never told about, where the dynamic is not just about love being present or absent, but about how much emotional intensity can be held before their system triggers self-protection. And that leads directly into the mistake that pushes them further away instantly, and it's not one dramatic action, it's a pattern that builds slowly over time without anyone realizing it, which is emotional pressure disguised as connection. This happens when reassurance becomes frequent, when emotional conversations start to feel like constant processing sessions, when closeness turns into expectation even subtly, where they begin to feel like they are responsible for regulating the emotional state of the relationship. From your perspective, this often comes from care, from wanting clarity, from wanting stability, but from their perspective, it can slowly shift the relationship from something that feels shared into something that feels emotionally weighted. And once that internal shift happens, their natural response is not confrontation, it's distance. Not because they don't care, but because distance is how they reduce perceived emotional demand. The difficult truth here is that the more someone feels they need to fix uncertainty through emotional intensity, the more uncertain the dynamic can become on the other side. It creates a loop where one person leans in to feel secure and the other steps back to feel regulated, and neither side is actually trying to hurt the other, but both are trying to restore internal balance in ways that unintentionally clash. And that's why the strange truth behind all of this is that it was never really about more love in the way people usually think about it, because love in isolation doesn't determine emotional stability in this kind of dynamic. What actually determines connection longevity is how that love is experienced internally, whether it feels spacious or suffocating, whether it feels steady or intense, whether it feels like something that exists alongside personal identity or something that starts to absorb it. This is where a lot of misunderstandings begin, because people assume that if love is real, it should automatically create closeness, but for avoidant attachment systems, closeness is not just emotional, it is physiological. It activates patterns of comfort and discomfort at the same time, and that internal contradiction is what shapes behavior more than conscious intention ever does. So when someone says, "I love you but I need space," it's not always emotional contradiction, it is often emotional overload being translated into action. And until you understand that love and emotional capacity are not always aligned in real time, the dynamic will always feel like something is missing, when in reality it is something being processed on a completely different internal timeline than the one you are experiencing. And once you understand that emotional capacity doesn't always move in sync with emotional feeling, something deeper starts to click into place, because beneath all of this there is actually a very specific internal switch that gets triggered in avoidant men, and it has less to do with the person in front of them and more to do with the way their system interprets emotional intensity in real time. It's almost like an internal calibration mechanism that constantly scans for balance between closeness and pressure, and when that balance tips too far in one direction, especially toward emotional demand or unpredictability, the system automatically shifts into self-protection mode. Not because they are consciously deciding to pull away, but because their nervous system has learned that too much emotional closeness without regulation can feel overwhelming. So what most people experience as sudden distance is often not a decision but a correction. And that correction becomes the invisible force that shapes everything that follows, because once the system associates certain emotional patterns with overwhelm, it starts anticipating them even before they fully happen. That's also why they seem cold in moments when you care more, because what you are experiencing as emotional expansion, they may be experiencing as emotional escalation. From your side, you're opening up, expressing, investing, trying to build connection, trying to stabilize something that feels uncertain. But internally, if their threshold is being approached or crossed, that same emotional expansion can start to feel like weight rather than warmth. It's not that they are incapable of feeling your care, it's that their system is filtering it through a different lens, one that is constantly asking, "Can I handle this level of emotional engagement right now?" And when the answer, even subconsciously, leans toward no, their behavior adjusts accordingly. That adjustment is what people interpret as emotional withdrawal or detachment, but underneath it there is still often awareness, still recognition, still emotional presence that simply isn't being expressed outwardly. This is why you can feel like you are pouring more into something that seems to be moving further away at the same time, because the two systems are responding to completely different internal signals. And this is where the concept of emotional space becomes not just important but central to everything. Because emotional space is not about distance in the way most people assume, it is about reducing internal pressure so that connection can exist without triggering the survival response of withdrawal. When there is too much emotional proximity too quickly, or too much expectation layered into interaction, the avoidant system doesn't interpret that as safety, it interprets it as responsibility. And responsibility, especially emotional responsibility for another person's state, is often what activates shutdown behavior. But when space exists, something very different happens internally. The emotional system no longer feels saturated, it no longer feels like it is being asked to constantly respond or regulate. Instead, there is room to breathe, room to observe, and most importantly, room to re-engage without pressure. And in that space, their perception of you can begin to shift, not because you are doing more, but because you are doing less in a very specific way. Less emotional chasing, less reactive intensity, less urgency to resolve uncertainty immediately. And that leads into something that most people struggle with emotionally, because the simple thing that actually changes the dynamic is not an action of addition, but an action of restraint. It is the ability to stop chasing in the way you normally would when you feel uncertainty rising. Not disappearing, not playing games, not creating manipulation or emotional silence, but simply stepping out of the pattern of constant pursuit that is driven by anxiety rather than alignment. When that shift happens, even subtly, the entire emotional environment changes. Because suddenly the avoidant is no longer interacting with someone who feels emotionally reactive to every shift in their behavior. Instead, they are interacting with someone who remains stable even when the dynamic is unstable. And that stability creates something they are not used to in high-intensity relational cycles: predictability without pressure. And predictability for a nervous system that is constantly scanning for emotional overload becomes incredibly noticeable. This is also why silence hits differently for them than words do, because words often exist inside the emotional cycle, while silence exists outside of it. Words can carry expectation, clarification, emotional weight, and subtle pressure even when they are loving. But silence, when it is calm and not reactive, removes the immediate demand for response. And in that absence of demand, something unexpected can happen. Attention increases. Not because they are being manipulated or ignored, but because the system is no longer overloaded. The mind starts to notice the gap where your usual emotional presence used to be, and in that gap, curiosity naturally begins to form. Not always immediately, not always consciously, but gradually as the emotional noise settles. And this is where many people misunderstand what is actually happening. They assume silence creates detachment, but in certain dynamics, silence actually creates space for internal recalibration, where the emotional image of you is no longer being overwritten by constant interaction and instead begins to reorganize itself in their memory with more clarity than before. And once that recalibration starts, the first stage is almost always confusion, because they are not used to your emotional presence changing in a way that is not reactive to them. They are used to patterns, cycles, predictability, and emotional responses based on their own behavior. So when that pattern breaks, even slightly, it disrupts their internal expectations. They start noticing your absence in a way that feels unfamiliar, not necessarily painful at first, but disorienting. And confusion in this context is not about missing you yet, it is about recalculating your emotional position in their mental framework. Because if your presence was previously predictable in one way, and now it is not behaving according to that pattern, their system has to update its internal model of you. And that update process is where curiosity begins to form, not as an emotional declaration, but as a quiet internal question of why the dynamic feels different than it used to. And once that confusion settles in, something even more subtle begins to unfold, because curiosity doesn't stay neutral for long in a system like this. It starts pulling attention in ways that feel almost involuntary. At first, it's not emotional intensity, it's observation. They notice gaps where your usual presence used to be. They notice responses that are no longer immediate or predictable. They notice that something in the pattern they were unconsciously relying on has shifted. And that shift forces their mind to do something it doesn't always prioritize in real time: reassess. Not reassess the relationship in a dramatic sense, but reassess your emotional availability, your consistency, your energy. And the interesting part is that this reassessment often happens without them attaching a strong emotional label to it. It's more like a background process running quietly while they continue with their life, yet it slowly increases mental reference points connected to you. So even though nothing dramatic is happening externally, internally, your presence starts re-entering their awareness in a way that feels slightly different than before. Not as pressure, not as pursuit, but as absence that has become noticeable. And from there, something very important begins to take shape: emotional recalibration. This is the second stage, and it is where their internal image of you starts to shift without them consciously deciding to change it. Because when someone is no longer responding in the same familiar emotional pattern, the mind doesn't just erase them, it updates them. It begins reorganizing memories, interactions, and impressions based on the new emotional data being received, which is your changed behavior, your reduced reactivity, your absence of predictable emotional engagement. And this is where perception starts to soften or shift, not because you have changed who you are, but because the emotional context around you has changed. In earlier stages, your presence might have been associated with intensity, expectation, emotional engagement, or even subtle pressure. But now, in your absence or reduced emotional availability, those associations start to lose dominance. And when that happens, other parts of your presence begin to surface in their awareness. Calmer memories, lighter interactions, moments of ease that were previously overshadowed by emotional intensity. This is not manipulation, it is how memory works when emotional saturation decreases. The mind naturally begins to rebalance the emotional weight of past experiences once the immediate pressure is removed. And as this recalibration continues, something even more noticeable begins to happen. They start thinking about you more, not less. This is where most people get confused because they assume distance should lead to forgetting. But in this type of dynamic, distance removes emotional saturation, and in that space, mental clarity has more room to operate. So instead of constant emotional stimulation pushing thoughts away, there is now silence, and in that silence, thoughts begin to surface on their own. Not always as longing, not always as regret, but as spontaneous mental returns. Moments of reflection that appear during otherwise unrelated parts of the day. Situations that trigger associative memory, small reminders that suddenly bring your presence back into awareness without warning. And because there is no longer an active emotional cycle pulling them away from those thoughts, those thoughts can linger longer than they did before. This is where the internal experience begins to shift from passive recognition into something slightly more emotionally charged, even if they don't express it outwardly. The key difference is that now your presence is no longer being filtered through immediate emotional interaction. It is being processed in reflection. But right at this point, there is a critical mistake that often destroys this entire shift before it has a chance to develop, and it usually comes from the other side of the dynamic. When people sense that something is changing, when they feel the shift in attention, when they notice signs of re-engagement or curiosity, they often react too quickly. They move back into old patterns of availability, emotional intensity, or explanation, trying to secure the connection while it feels like it is reopening. But what they don't realize is that timing matters just as much as behavior. Because if the emotional system on the other side is still in recalibration mode, sudden re-engagement can collapse the very space that allowed curiosity to form in the first place. It reintroduces the same emotional pressure pattern that caused withdrawal earlier, and the system responds the only way it knows how, by reducing engagement again. Not because the interest disappeared, but because the emotional environment changed too quickly for stability to form. And this is why so many situations feel like they almost shift, but then fall back into distance again. It's not failure of connection, it's interruption of process. And that brings us into a very important distinction that most people overlook: the difference between distance and detachment. Distance is often behavioral. It is what you see: less communication, less initiation, less visible emotional expression. But detachment is internal. It is emotional disconnection, lack of interest, lack of mental return. And in many avoidant dynamics, what people interpret as detachment is actually just regulated distance. The emotional system is still active, still responsive, still processing, but it is not expressing itself through direct engagement. This is why appearances can be misleading. Someone can look completely indifferent externally while still having internal activity connected to you. And someone can appear briefly warm and engaged while still maintaining emotional boundaries internally. The visible layer does not always match the internal layer. And once you understand that distinction, you begin to see why chasing visible signals alone often leads to misinterpretation. Because the real emotional process is not happening in what you see, it is happening in how their system regulates connection, space, and internal comfort. And that is where something interesting happens in the final stage of this shift. Emotional magnetism begins to form not from pursuit, but from regulation. When your presence is no longer associated with emotional overload, when your energy is no longer reactive, when your interaction is no longer driven by urgency, something subtle changes in how they experience you internally. You become less of a trigger for their protective system and more of a stable reference point in their mind. Not because you are doing something performative, but because the emotional environment around you has changed. And in that stability, attraction often begins to re-emerge in a different form, not the intensity-driven version from before, but a quieter, more observational form of interest, one that grows in moments of calm rather than moments of emotional escalation. And that is where the entire dynamic begins to shift again, not through force, not through chasing, but through the simple psychological reality